Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our return to Lackawanna, our Lackawanna Past Times feature. I'm Sarah Pacini, the Assistant Director at the Lackawanna Historical Society. This is our 51st program, and today we'll be joined by Professor Sean Brennan, who is Professor of History at the University of Scranton. Sean received his BA in History from Rockhurst University, a master's degree from Villanova, and recently received a PhD in History from Notre Dame. Dr. Brennan's fourth book, War in Austin, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., and the Cold War at the United Nations, will be published this coming December. Today, Sean's going to join us to talk about one of Scranton's favorite sons, Governor William Scranton, and his tenure as the ambassador to the United Nations in the late 1970s. So, Sean, I'll turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you for having me today, and thank you everyone for attending. It's nice to see you all here on a Friday afternoon, and I promise I will do everything I can to make it worth your while. So I'm going to take over the screen in just a second to put up my PowerPoint. I just found a few images I want to use for this. But for those of you, again, I already got an excellent introduction, so I don't need to go over about myself too much longer. But just real quickly, what this project is on William Scranton and his UN service is kind of the postscript to a writing project I've been working on for a number of years now. So as Sarah said, I'm got book number 4 coming out in December, assuming I get the page proofs done. Those came in yesterday. So, but it's part of a writing project of American ambassadors at the United Nations. I am by training a historian in modern Europe, particularly Russia, Germany, and Austria. But one of my fields at Notre Dame was American foreign relations. And I've always been interested in American individuals who took a big part in international relations, global diplomacy, that type of thing, or at least were involved somehow with events outside the United States. And you can certainly say that about William Warren Scranton. And so I wrote this book on Truman's and Eisenhower's UN ambassadors, and I just want to do a little bit more on it, write kind of a postscript to it by looking at, I want to find one other, I thought, notable American ambassador to the United Nations who I could write about. And I haven't done too much on local history. And I've been trying to do a little bit more on that in my own field, and trying to learn more about local history and meet local historians has taken me to some very interesting and fascinating and terrific places. It's ironically how I met my wonderful fiance, Stephanie Longo. But I thought maybe writing something on William Scranton would be ideal. And actually, there's that marker right outside the Lackawanna Historical Society about William Scranton on the university campus. I remember walking around campus one day, I literally looked up and saw that again. I've seen it many times before, but that is actually when it hit me. I said, well, why don't I write about him? I was trying to decide maybe Adlai Stevenson or G.N. Kirkpatrick or someone like that, but why not William Scranton? And that way I can finally do something on local history. And I've been also trying to do some more writing about the 1970s, so I thought that'd be a good idea as well. Okay, so that's what drew me to it. In terms of the sources I used for this, I always like to talk about that first before I get into the presentation. I had the fortune of looking at William Scranton's papers, which are in the Special Collections Library at Pennsylvania State University. So I spent some time there in August of 2021 doing some research, basically as soon as the library opened back up again. I actually got a grant to pursue this research from the University of Scranton back in 2020, but I wasn't able to really use that money because of all the archives being closed because of COVID. So once Pennsylvania State University, Penn State, finally opened their libraries back up to outside researchers, which was a little bit after they opened them up for students, I was able to go there and do some research there. I also took a look at some material from the Ford administration's library. President Ford's presidential library is kind of interesting because the library itself is in Ann Arbor, attached to the University of Michigan, but the museum is in Grand Rapids, which is where Ford was from. And it's the only presidential library that I'm aware of that has that kind of unique arrangement. So I was able to look at some of those papers as well. And also I had the chance of interviewing William Scranton's deputy, his assistant while he was UN ambassador, who was a admiral in the Coast Guard named John Fagel. So I had a chance to interview him over a year ago, and I incorporated some of his insights into the paper as well. And then I looked at some of the State Department's records, their Foreign Relations of the United States series. Okay, so William Scranton served at, I'll go ahead and take over the screen now, the United Nations, following the tumultuous service of Scranton's immediate predecessor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Especially when it came to delegates from what was referred to as the Third World, countries that were in many cases coming out of European colonialism, had recently won their independence, and not fully aligned with either the Soviet Union and its allies, often referred to as the Second World, or the United States and its allies, often referred to at the time as the First World. Another thing he had to deal with was the issue in the 1970s of international terrorism, and connected to that, the Middle Eastern dispute between Israel and much of the Arab world, and also dealing with the ever-present issue of the Cold War during the height of a period known as détente, where supposedly between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was a lot greater cooperation between the two on certain issues within Europe. But another thing détente brought to the world's attention to a greater extent than it had been before, at least for a long time, was the issue of human rights, particularly when that arises at the Helsinki Conference in 1975, right before Scranton took over. And in many ways, and I discovered this, certain things Scranton was advocating for would later be used by the Carter administration and by the Reagan administration in the later stages of the Cold War. So in many ways, he was ahead of his time. And again, it was only about a year, but quite a few interesting things happened. It's a nice microcosm of a lot of the big diplomatic issues going on in the 1970s. Okay, and again, I know a lot of you are probably fairly familiar with William Scranton and his career, so I don't think there's any need to go over that again in a lot of detail. But a few things I thought I would mention was that Scranton, of course, attended Yale as an undergraduate, and then he attended Yale Law School. And one of his literal classmates and a good friend of his was another person who, like Scranton, deferred his law school education to serve in the Second World War. And that was, of course, Gerald Ford. So who'd, of course, be Nixon's successor as president. And of course, Scranton would serve directly under him as UN ambassador. Another thing that's interesting about Scranton's position as American ambassador to the UN was Scranton, of course, served one term as a Pennsylvania congressman in the early 1960s. And despite polls showing that he could have been a clear winner, could have been easily reelected to Congress, he was persuaded by the Republican Party to run for governor. And he served one term as Pennsylvania governor. And by all accounts, it was a very successful term. Back then in the Pennsylvania Constitution, governors only could serve one term because, again, polls would have shown that he could have easily won re-election if he had chosen to run. He was seen by some in 1964 as a possible Republican nomination for the presidency. And if for a little while he was leading in the polls, although that fell through, partially over controversy over whether Eisenhower had endorsed Scranton or not. But after that, actually, he serves in a number of capacities for the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, and the Ford administration. But he doesn't take any formal jobs. He serves on a lot of different commissions. He's on Nixon has him on the Commission on Campus Unrest following the shootings at Kent State University in Ohio. Also for Nixon, he served as a special envoy to the Middle East and to Western Europe. For Johnson, he served on a commission on insurance for areas that had been damaged by ethnic riots, but he had always turned down a number of official positions. And so he finally accepted in 1976 Ford's offer and Henry Kissinger's offer to be the American ambassador to the United Nations. And that would be actually his last official government position, although he led quite an active life up to his passing over a few years ago. Okay, so now I think what I'll do is take it to the discussion of the United Nations itself and the international environment in the 1970s, and then the activities of some of Scranton's predecessor, Moynihan, and Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger. Anyway, by the way, this picture isn't just some random picture of Scranton. This is him during his ceremony becoming the American ambassador to the United Nations, and him specifically being sworn in here. So again, not just some random picture. This is him becoming the American ambassador. Okay, so here's a picture of the United Nations headquarters in the 1970s. Specifically, this picture is taken from literally 1970. One other thing I found out, by the way, in writing my book is that the famous United Nations headquarters actually wasn't completed until the early 1950s. So during the 40s and early 1950s, it was located in Long Island in Flushing, in a former factory, actually, that had been converted to the UN headquarters. The famous headquarters at Turtle Bay, again, wasn't complete until the early 1950s. And actually, a headquarters for the American delegation of the United Nations wasn't completed until the early 1960s. But the United Nations of the 1970s was a very different one that, say, Warren Austin, who was Truman's ambassador, or Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was Eisenhower's ambassador, served under. By the 1970s, most of the European empires, which ruled over so much of Africa and Asia from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, had finally come to an end. And actually, it's in the 1970s that you see the very end, the end of the Portuguese Empire in Africa, and the independence of Angola in the southwest and Mozambique in the southeast. The Portuguese were the first ones in and the last ones out. So the composition of the delegates, for example, was very different in the 1970s. A lot more delegations from a much more diversified part of the world. A lot more delegates from Africa and Asia in particular. And Scranton himself actually attended as American ambassador to the United Nations. He was the official United States government representative to a number of the independence ceremonies of a number of African countries. He was specifically sent there as a way of trying to make a good first impression on these countries and their independence efforts. And also to ensure, because this was always a priority, even during the 1970s, where Cold War tensions between Washington and Moscow had been somewhat reduced, was to ensure that these newly independent states do not immediately become allies with the Soviet Union. And that was a huge concern, and it had been maybe not the earliest periods of the Cold War, but certainly from the mid-1950s onward. And this was a big part of my book coming out in December. But I mean, one of the reasons why the Eisenhower administration in 1956 came down so hard on Britain and France and Israel in their attack on Egypt against Nasser's government there in 1956 was because Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, were worried that if it looked like America was just backing up the old European imperial powers like it was 1856 and not 1956, then as Dulles said, the whole third world could be lost to the United States forever, and would always be in the embrace of the Soviet regime. And even 20 years later, that was a big concern, and Scranton was well aware of that. And one of the other things, of course, about the 1970s is while you have a reduction of Cold War tensions in Europe, you have a number of proxy wars going and proxy efforts going on in South America, for example, in Chile in 1973, and in Africa. Like after Angola wins its independence from Portugal, you have a long civil war going on in that country that actually goes on the way until 2004. But on one hand, you have the Marxist regime in Angola, which is being supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. And then you have the anti-communist resistance against it, which is being supported by the United States and by Zaire and by South Africa. Which led to a lot of interesting bedfellows during this time period. So again, reduced tensions in Europe's maybe, but in the Middle East, Africa, South America, it's still the Cold War is still going hot, so to speak. Okay, so Scranton's predecessor as ambassador of the United Nations was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, later famous for his service to the state of New York as a senator. Like Scranton, he had served in various different capacities in various different presidential administrations, both Republicans and Democrats. And that's actually one thing Moynihan and Scranton had in common. And then I had to argue two other subjects in my book, Warren Austin and Henry Cabot Lodge, that all of these men were willing to work for different presidential administrations, regardless if the president was on the part of the same political party that they were. And Moynihan had kind of a fiery tenure as UN ambassador. He was known as being rather a tough man who, if he didn't like you, didn't agree with you, you were going to find out, and he wasn't going to mince words. Now, on one hand, the Nixon administration, and then when Nixon's gone in 74, Ford appreciated how Moynihan, for example, had led the charge against the Soviet Union and a number of the Arab delegations who tried to argue that Israel was an apartheid state like South Africa, and to argue that Zionism itself was a form of racism. Moynihan had taken a very strong position at the UN against that and had denounced that in a number of speeches. But he had also gotten at one point basically into almost a shouting match, the floor of the United Nations against the Ugandan delegation, denouncing its dictator, Idi Amin, in very personal terms, and arguing, and this wasn't entirely wrong, but that for a number of the African countries that had won independence from Britain and France and Portugal, that they hadn't made moves towards establishing democratic institutions, and that they were rejecting supposedly universal concepts of human rights. And then there was also the fact that he didn't get along well with a lot of his own staff, and a lot of them were kept into the dark about exactly what their tasks were and what they should do. And Moynihan kind of had a very visceral dislike of delegates from the Soviet Union or from Eastern Europe or from certain third world countries. And Moynihan and Henry Kissinger, who had been Richard Nixon's national security advisor in his first term and the Secretary of State in his second term, and then, of course, Ford kept him on as Secretary of State, Kissinger and Moynihan really didn't get along very well. And by Moynihan's own admissions, one of the reasons why he resigned from the position in early 1976 was Kissinger had informed him in basically no uncertain terms, you either resign or I'm gonna fire you. I'm gonna remove you as ambassador. So what would you like to do? And Moynihan decided to resign. And of course, that is what opens up the position and enables Scranton he finally accepts the offer and he becomes the American ambassador to the United Nations. Now, if you look at Gerald Ford, Ford, of course, becomes president through circumstances that were unprecedented in American history and really haven't been replicated since. And of course, Ford was somewhat aware of this. He had replaced Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, when Agnew was forced to resign because of his involvement in a real estate speculation scandal. I always find that amazing about the Nixon administration. The vice president and then the president both have to resign from office through two completely different scandals. So Ford becomes Nixon's vice president. And then, of course, Nixon, a few months after Spiro Agnew resigns himself in the spring of 1974 over the Watergate scandal in order to avoid almost certain impeachment and then removal from office. So Ford was the first American president who became president without even making a case of having been elected in any capacity. And he appointed Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. Now, again, Ford, a World War II combat veteran in the United States Navy, a long-term congressional representative for Michigan, representing the city of Grand Rapids and the area around it, had a lot of bipartisan support. He was, among other things, he served on the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And that's one of the reasons why Nixon had appointed Ford as his vice president, because of Ford's bipartisan reputation. Now, in terms of foreign policy, Ford didn't really want to make too many waves. He wanted to continue Nixon's policies of détente towards the Soviet Union, making arrangements on arms control, for example, reducing, at least if not the size, at least the size of the growth of the United States' and the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenals. And this was something that Henry Kissinger was strongly in support of. And both of them had problems, again, with not always the views of Moynihan, but some of the tactics that he used. And they wanted to appoint Scranton because of his reputation as being a somewhat more level-headed individual, a more diplomatic individual. Humor's argued that's just who we need at the United Nations right now, and also to simply to improve the work environment of the American delegation to the United Nations, and to work on improving relations with a lot of the delegates from the Third World in particular, and possibly if those from the Soviet bloc. Okay, and so that was largely something that Scranton was willing to do. And Ford also wanted to make it clear that in this era, the United States' dedication to supporting the work of the United Nations was as strong as ever. And I'll quote him here. This is the statement he released when he announced Scranton as the ambassador. "America's commitment to the United Nations is firm. The world needs the United Nations for the cause of peace. Because we value that institution, we work to strengthen it. At the same time, we will not hesitate to speak out clearly against actions that threaten its viability, nor will we hesitate to speak out forcefully in defense of our interests and our principles." So what follows is the first thing Scranton does is he schedules a number of meetings with the American staff, which numbered about 125 in total, if you're wondering how many people we're talking about, and also with a number of officials in the United States State Department who dealt regularly with UN affairs. And he continued this on having regular meetings with them, making sure that they were clear about what their assignments were and how their work was going. And he became very popular with them. According to Fagel, the delegates, and some people think this was kind of a little jab at Moynihan, but quickly gave Scranton the nickname Mr. Nice Guy. He also contacted many of the delegations to the UN from many third world countries, and he promised that regardless of any disagreements they might have, he would always be willing to personally meet with them and discuss any issues or concerns that he had. Although he didn't make any promises that American foreign policy was going to radically change, in Fagel's words, that Scranton's philosophy had always been in the foreign and domestic arenas, and I quote him here, "You can only get what you want by giving others a piece of the action." Scranton divided his work in between two locations in New York City. The first was the American mission to the United Nations headquarters, which is literally right across the street from the UN facility at Turtle Bay. And the second was the ambassadorial suite and the 42nd floor of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan, which again, I think is kind of interesting because in Austin's time and in Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.'s time in the 40s and 50s, that's where the entire delegation met. I mean, literally the American government rented out a number of the floors of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and that's where the entire American delegation to the United Nations lived and worked. He also hosted a number of dinners and parties on a regular basis for a lot of foreign diplomats, especially not just in New York, but also about once a month, he would host these big celebrations at his home with his family in Dalton, Pennsylvania. So the idea was that that was going to be kind of like a special privilege, like if there was a delegation from a particular country that the United States wanted to work with in the upcoming session of the United Nations. It's like, okay, celebrations in New York are nice, but see if the Scrantons will host them in Dalton and see if we can meet them there. So for a period of about a month or so, Dalton was a very important diplomatic meeting place throughout the mid-1970s at the Scrantons' home. The first issue that came up on a regular basis from the records that I found was Israel's relationship or the lack thereof to the Arab world. And one thing that Scranton, during his time in the late 60s as the American envoy to the Middle East, and he had told Nixon this, and he had told Ford this too, that although Scranton admired Israel as a democratic state in a region that wasn't very democratic and a staunch U.S. ally, he said that it was weakening the American position sometimes in the Middle East if the United States was always being seen as taking the side of Israel in one dispute or another. That being said, however, one of his most famous actions on the floor of the United Nations was in the summer of 1976, right during America's bicentennial celebration. On the other end of the world, of course, an Air France flight was hijacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists and also members of the West German Red Army faction. And the plane was flown to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, whose dictator, Idi Amin, had already cleared this with the terrorists in advance. I mean, that's something that's come out more recently, that they could use his airport as a place to stay and hide. And although a lot of the non-Israeli passengers on the Air France flight were released, the Air France crew chose to stay with them. And eventually on July the 4th, 1976, the Israeli Defense Force launched Operation Thunderbolt to rescue the Israeli passengers and the Air France crew at Entebbe Airport. And they were successful in doing so. A few of the hostages were killed, one of which, who had been having medical problems, who was taken to a Ugandan hospital, was also killed by Ugandan soldiers afterwards. But they were successful in killing all of the terrorists, as well as 45 Ugandan soldiers stationed at the airport. But they were successful in rescuing the hostages. And this is a photograph here on the left of the hostages, the Israeli ones, arriving back in Israel. The United States was not informed of Operation Thunderbolt until basically right before it literally began, but the Ford administration voiced its support for the operation, and Scranton shared those sentiments. And he gave a number of statements at the floor of the United Nations, specifically on July 12th, stating that while he acknowledged the Israeli army had violated Ugandan territory in conducting this operation, and such a breach would have usually been impermissible under the Charter of the United Nations. But since he argued that Israel had a right to defend its own citizens based on self-defense, and also because, as Scranton pointed out, not only had the Ugandan government not done anything to save the hostages, but was actively preventing their rescue, that Israel was justified in launching Operation Thunderbolt. And much like Moynihan, in April of that year, Scranton had also again denounced, like Moynihan had done, the linkage of Zionism, and that Zionism itself was a form of racism. That being said, however, he argued at other cases on the United Nations that and some of the claims of a number of the Arab states against Israel for territorial concessions were legitimate. He also attempted to involve the Palestinian Liberation Organization in discussions at the UN. One thing that Ford had said was, we don't allow them to speak at the UN unless they recognize Israel's right to exist, which the PLO hadn't done. But Scranton had told Ford a number of times, Arafat doesn't take that seriously. We should allow them to make their case at the United Nations as well. Looks like it's 2:31, so I do want to talk about one other issue that's really important that you can see here on this slide, is that in 1975, at the Finnish capital of Helsinki, you have what was called the Helsinki Conference, and what comes out of it are the Helsinki Accords. And it's widely seen as one of the if not one of the high points of détente, this period of reducing of tensions in Europe, because you have all of the NATO countries meeting with all the representatives of the Warsaw Pact countries in Finland, in Helsinki. And here's a picture of it. There's Ford. There's East Germany's dictator Erich Honecker right next to him. And the NATO countries promised to the Warsaw Pact countries that the World War II borders were secure, that West Germany or any other Western country would not try to change them, that the Western countries would not try to end communist rule by force of arms, that type of thing. And on the flip side of that, the Soviet Union and its satellite states had agreed on paper to respect Western concepts of human rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, so on and so forth. Now, Scranton and Ford and Kissinger had no illusions that these regimes would actually honor these promises. But for all three men, the idea was if they promised to agree to them, this is something we can use against them on the floors of the United Nations and elsewhere. And this is something that human rights groups and dissident groups can also use against these regimes. Because the old argument Marxist regimes would make was that, Western governments have this concept of human rights which aren't real human rights, like freedom of speech, religion, assembly, the press. That's not a real human right. That's a bourgeois definition of human rights. And like we have our own definitions of human rights. The people in our countries are free from economic exploitation and poverty, and they're guaranteed employment and medical care. And those are our definitions of human rights, and we don't need yours. And so now they were, at least on paper, agreeing to respect certain Western concepts of human rights as well. Now, Scranton had attempted at this period to do the best he could to reach out with the Soviet delegates as well. In case anyone was wondering, no, the Soviet delegates nor any of the Eastern European ones did not get to go out to Dalton because they weren't allowed to. There were very strict rules throughout almost the entirety of the Cold War of a lot of delegates from the Soviet Union, the satellite states, engaging in any undue socialization with delegates from countries who weren't communist. But Scranton kind of is showing the atmosphere of the era. There was an attack on the Soviet delegation building at the United Nations. Two men stepped out of a car and fired their pistols into the building, shooting out a window. And Scranton gave a speech to the United Nations strongly denouncing that. But at the same time, he would attack the Soviet government when he felt it was necessary, such as in late October at the Appeals to Conscience dinner in New York City. He denounced the Soviet government because of recent reports that Jewish demonstrators in Moscow had tried to hold a demonstration in Red Square asking for permission to immigrate to Israel. A number of men from the Soviet secret police, the KGB, had driven up and beaten up the demonstrators and then thrown them into police trucks and then driven them away and imprisoned them. So he strongly denounced that as well. And then at other times, again, Scranton could be the dutiful cold warrior when he was called upon to do so. One thing that Fagel told me that Scranton wasn't all that pleased on, but he used the American veto in the Security Council to deny in 1976 the entrance of Vietnam into the United Nations. If you remember, of course, in 1975, the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, was overrun and conquered by the North. The North unites itself with the South, establishes a one-party communist dictatorship over all of Vietnam, which you still have today, and then made application to join the United Nations. And Scranton, again, used his veto to deny them entry into the United Nations, although, of course, eventually they were let in. Now, by all accounts, by the way, Scranton really enjoyed being American ambassador to the United Nations. And if Ford had been reelected in November of 1976, he certainly would have continued in that capacity. But that was not to be the case. Of course, Jimmy Carter defeats Gerald Ford to become the American president starting in January of 1977. And Carter had informed Scranton that he was going to replace him as American ambassador to the United Nations, which, again, there was nothing really surprising in that. But Scranton decided in November of 1976 to give a major speech at the United Nations, and this is him actually asking, permission to go ahead and give this speech on November 24th, 1976, entitled "Human Rights, Let Us Mean What We Say." And in that speech, Scranton laid out a new method in his mind to incorporate the promotion of human rights as a vital component of American foreign policy. And this is a good summation of his views on how this could be done. He stated that human rights is as vital and generic of an interest of the United Nations as peacekeeping itself. And he admitted the record of the United Nations in protecting human rights had been mixed at best. I'll quote him again here. "The rhetoric on human rights has been superb. The record of accomplishment, however, has been sadly deficient. Discussions about human rights remain mired in political context, and the United Nations have been long on declarations on human rights and very short on implementations for them. Nor did the United States government believe human rights were only for certain people at certain times, but were the rights for every person across the world." And Scranton also forcefully ejected the argument popular amongst many third world leaders that economic development was more important than human rights. As he said, promoting and cherishing freedom is both a moral necessity and it is also a precondition to better living. And one solution, and he also then went on to say the communist states, particularly the Soviet Union, since the founding of the United Nations, had cynically used language concerning human rights they had no real interest in following, as the Marxist dogma in these states were founded on remained opposed to political and economic freedom. One solution Scranton proposed was to end the secrecy surrounding the discussion of the UN Human Rights Committee and to ensure it conducted its work openly during every session of the United Nations. At the end of his speech, he recommended the creation of a UN Court of Human Rights, as well as the creation of regional human rights organizations that can report on a regular basis to the United Nations. He also admitted that one problem with the UN Human Rights Movement Committee was that too many of the countries on it were dictators themselves, who were sometimes more interested in covering up human rights violations, their own, than exposing them. He concluded the speech by saying, "The conscience of mankind can ignore injustice in the dark. When the lights are on, few men of conscience can be quiet. This body must choose between darkness and decency, between protecting the violators of human dignity and protecting human dignity itself in the light of world opinion and the clear light of truth." So Scranton was replaced by Andrew Young, former pastor and civil rights activist and a Democratic congressman from Georgia, who was the first African-American ambassador to the United Nations in January of 1977. You could see, however, the effect this had on Scranton was, although this was his last diplomatic position, he wasn't done with the United Nations. He took the position as president of the American United Nations Association, a civic organization designed to promote American support for the UN, and he became its leader in early 1977. And he served in this capacity for a number of years. And again, according to Fagel, it was one of his happiest assignments post 1977. So in summary, his period as American ambassador, although a brief one, was a success. It was a successful one in some ways. He had promoted a new approach for the American government regarding human rights, one continued by the Carter administration. Despite some criticism domestically, he had followed a balanced approach regarding controversies in the Middle East, regarding trying to cultivate allies in Africa, and relations with the Soviet Union. He had improved the working environment for the American delegation at the United Nations and helped ease the tensions between the United States and some of the countries of the third world. It was a course that a number of his predecessors would have certainly approved of. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Sean. That was an excellent program. I know when Governor Scranton left office, as governor, one of the things he said was he was swearing off public service, that he had done his duty and he wasn't going to continue in public service. And he, failed, but pretty spectacularly, I think, since he did continue to serve on national and in an international level. Does anyone have any questions to add to this? I don't see anything in the chat, but does anyone have any specific questions?
if people are thinking up one other thing I guess I can add is that Kissinger was a little bit more cynical than Scranton was about the idea of promoting human rights at the United Nations or trying to use that as a weapon against the communist bloc countries. But that being said, the relationship between the two men was much better than it's had been between Kissinger and Moynihan. And Fagel said that Scranton had got along very well Ford. I mean, the two of them are old friends. He got in a pretty good relationship with Kissinger, which wasn't always the easiest thing to do. Kissinger also had a reputation of being a very, very difficult man to work for. There was a joke about working for Henry Kissinger. It was like being a mushroom, because if you work for Kissinger, you were fed shit, you were kept in the dark, and at the end of the day, you got canned. So again, at least for Scranton, he didn't suffer that fate.
Well, that's good. That's a lucky break there. Did you get a sense from his papers or from the research that you were doing? Was it like a reluctantly taken on position, or was he more or less kind of gung ho to continue in service?
I think Scranton was waiting for the right position. I think the reason why he took a job as envoys or these commissions was that he was only going to have to serve for a limited period of time, and that was it. And if you look at his biography, he was also serving on the boards of so many different economic groups and charities within northeastern Pennsylvania. I frankly wonder how he had any time for anything. But I think and according to Fagel and some of his other writings, he genuinely thought this was a place where he could make a really positive contribution. And he felt like he was doing that during his time being. And he didn't tell Ford, for example, that, okay, I'm only going to serve for the end of your first term, then find someone else. He would have been happy to do it again. I mean, another thing I found out about just being American ambassador to the UN, it's a very difficult job. I mean, it's very rare to find someone, if the president's a two-term president, someone who served as ambassador the entire time. I mean, Lodge is our longest serving UN ambassador. He served almost all of Eisenhower's 2 terms. Warren Austin served for 6 years. And after that, it really starts to drop off. It's a tough position. A lot of people don't want to do it for much longer than they have to. But I think Scranton would have, if Ford had been reelected, he would have stuck around for at least a few more years.
Thank you again, Sean, for joining us for that wonderful information to add to our cache of stories about Governor Scranton. Our next program for Lackawanna Pastimes will take place on October 28th. I will be joined by Julie Manwaring from the Historical Society of the Abingtons. Julie will be talking about the 100th anniversary of the Lackawanna Trail, the road that's today the Route 6 and 11 through Clark Summit. This road itself was opened to great fanfare in 1922. So Julie will be talking about the 100th anniversary of the Lackawanna Trail. Again, Sean, thank you very much for joining us, and have a lovely day, everyone.